The next project is this 2020 Kia Stinger GT all-wheel drive. Back in the November timeframe, I did ceramic coating and PPF on this vehicle, and now we're into June of the following year. The owner is the gentleman who owns this vehicle. He is interested in doing a number of modifications, and he is taking a very, what I would call, measured, conservative, and tasteful approach to what he wants to do with this. So he's done a lot of research with regards to mods, tuning, all the things that are in the marketplace and available for this vehicle at the current time. And so he's been very selective, and he's put a lot of thought into what he wants to do. In addition to the mods, he's, as you can already see, he's done the cold air intakes from InGen, and he's done some carbon bits, including these braces. He wants to do this in carbon. I'll get this off as soon as I pull the front end. This is actually attached to the fascia underneath. So I'll get this off, get this to him, and then he can get it to the carbon fiber fabricator. He also has the engine cover is with the carbon fabricator at the current time as well. So there's a number of things going on with this vehicle which are very interesting. And again, he's really doing what I would do if it were my vehicle, and taking a very measured approach to this, which is great. Let's move over here and take a look at what we will be installing on this vehicle. We have a number of components laying here. We'll start on the left. This is the Mishimoto. This is, I don't know if it's cold air or hot air sides of the intercooler, but there's a lot of intercooler plumbing here, connectors, and it just reeks of quality. And I mean that in a very pandering way, because it's Mishimoto. They make great products, and even in the manner in which it was boxed and packaged, it's so nice. Over here on the right, we have the intercooler. That intercooler is heavy. I was surprised how heavy it is, but nevertheless, we'll be unpackaging this and getting this installed as well. More closer in, we're doing spark plugs, we're doing a catch can, we're doing some carbon bits, and then these are absolutely beautiful. This looks like something more you would hang on a wall versus putting on a vehicle, but they're from JA Airscoops. They're 3D printed, and these are you're basically air inlets or intake snouts, whatever you want to call them, for the vehicle. So it's a really nice assortment of parts here that we'll be installing, and it's going to be a fun project. I really look forward to doing this. I will tell you up front, this is not an installation, a how-to, or anything like that video. If you want to know how to do most of what you see on the floor here, you really need to go over to Mishimoto's YouTube channel. They do an outstanding job with regards to showing you all the necessary steps to perform this installation. What I will do is identify things that vary from that video. So maybe there's something that was a running change in production, maybe a fastener or a connector or something isn't like it's shown in the video, and if there are variances, I'll call those out. I'll also call out things that I did to kind of make it easier on myself as I do this project. So really looking forward to that, to what's going on with this, and looking forward to getting into this. It's not something I'm going to do in one day. It'll be over probably several days, depending on how much time I can allocate to this project. I've got other projects going on, but this is a priority. I want to get this done and get it back to the owner. I know he's excited, and he's been waiting very patiently. He had to wait, I think it was 3 to 4 months to take delivery of the intercooler. So supply chain issues across the world right now, across the globe, and that was one of them. So it's taken time to get the parts, it's taken time to get the vehicle into me to have them installed, and I want to get this done and get it out the door for him. So we'll move on to the next step. Moving on to the next step in the project, I have removed the front fascia, the forwardmost under tray, the intercooler, as well as a number of other parts which we will get into momentarily. First, let's take a look at this under tray, and I really geek out about stuff like this. This is made out of a fibrous material, and I especially appreciate how they have pressed the washers into this piece. So it's an integral part of this. I think there's 6 of them in this particular panel, and it's less aggravation. These things, you know, they're mounted, they don't get away from you, etc. And I also like this black plastic finger screw, which you know, allows you to keep the panel in place while you're either removing all the fasteners or reinstalling all the fasteners. It's just a nice touch. And I come from the BMW camp, where I've been working on German automobiles for the better part of 30 years, and mostly BMWs, some Mercedes-Benz, and more recently Teslas, which are made in the USA. But it's just small touches like this that I really appreciate. As far as the intercooler is concerned, it looks small sitting here on the floor, and of course it's much smaller than the Mishimoto, the upgraded component that we'll be putting in place. Aside from the physical size, I think there's a pretty significant weight difference. This is much lighter, obviously. The other one's going to be heavier. I'll weigh them, I'll compare them, and I'll put that in a later video segment. Here we have the fascia, nothing really to mention on the front or outer side of this, and we have these strut tower braces here, which these are aftermarket. They are carbon fiber. They were installed by the owner, and they run diagonally from the strut towers to the forward structure. So let's take a look at the other side of the fascia. You get situated here, and okay, so this panel right here is a separate piece. It's not part of the fascia. The owner would like to do this in carbon fiber, which would go really well with the other carbon dress-up pieces that he has either already on the vehicle or he's working towards. And the problem with this is it's not easy to remove while the fascia is on the vehicle. Okay, so you've got the plastic pop rivets here, which are very easy to get to. They're on top. But underneath you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Phillips head screws. And that in itself is not a problem, except you can't get to them very easily. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, you can just flex the you-know-what out of this and do something very unnatural. And you can, but there is a beam right here. There are other obstructions. And while you can do that with this piece, you're not going to be able to do that when you replace this with carbon if you choose to do that. So just a heads up, the fascia really needs to come off the vehicle to remove this piece, and that's unfortunate, but that's the way they designed it. So in the floor here we have the air intakes as well as the shroud, and the shroud does have to be modified. It has to be sectioned and cut. There's going to be some custom fabrication here that will go on later on in this process. I am really happy with how this project is going so far. Nothing really of circumstance to mention. I will say that you'll probably, and this was showed not in the early part of the Mishimoto video, installation video, but later on, you've got these little caps that are on each of the worm gears. So when you encounter one of those, when I first saw this, I thought it was some type of security nut or fastener, and it's not. You can just take a very thin screwdriver and pop those off, or a pair of pliers, what have you, which they actually do later in that video. But when I first came across this, I'm like, what the heck is that? So got beyond that little hurdle, and I really like the sinister Mad Max look here that we have going on with all the front end components removed. But everything forward of the chassis structure has been removed. the things that we need to remove as part of this project. The next step will be actually getting into all of these clips, the plumbing, pulling all of this out, and of course going all the way up into the throttle body. So I'll be removing all of this. It all has to come out. So far so good. I'm really excited about this project. We're also doing a Mishimoto catch can, which will go, I believe, up in that space there. So lots to do, lots of fun, and we'll move on to the next step. Something I intended to mention in the last segment is this structure right here. If you have a look at this, it looks like a square, and then if you look back, it's tied into and goes up over the wheel arch, and it's also tied into the frame structure of the vehicle. What's interesting about this is called Sorb, which is small offset reinforcement barrier. When the vehicle is actually in an accident, and let's say the intruding vehicle misses the front bumper structure here, it's going to be absorbed by this, and this is really what well, it's actually this along with the wheel and tire. This is really what saves the driver, or if it happens on the passenger side, from major injury. And this is something that manufacturers have really started paying a lot of attention to in the last few years. It's interesting to see how Kia Hyundai has done this. Okay folks, it's time to do a weigh-in, old versus new intercoolers, as I mentioned I would do earlier in the video. This is not a scientific comparison. It's merely put one intercooler on the scale, weigh it, put the other one on the scale, and weigh it. Now, I can tell you that I cannot pick up the Mishimoto intercooler, the new intercooler, with one hand and do video at the same time, and I'm not going to put the camera on a tripod, at least not now. So I'll put the first one on the scale, I'll pause the video, I'll move the Mishimoto on the scale and show the comparison weight. There are some additional bits that come with the Mishimoto intercooler. There's different top mounts, and I think there's a standoff or two. Again, this isn't scientific, this is just merely a comparison of the intercoolers. We won't get into all the other, small things that may cause the weight to swing a few ounces one way or the other. So let's go with the first, the old intercooler, and do take note that it has this plastic shroud, which is it's riveted on the bottom and bolted on the sides. I don't know why they put anti-tamper marks there, but how amusing that is. So here we go. 10.6 pounds. I think that's showing up a little kind of flickery in the video, but I'm going to pause now for just a moment, take this off, set this down. You can see that the scale is calibrated, and I'll come right back. All right folks, the Mishimoto intercooler is on the scales. We're showing 30.4 pounds. That is 19.8 pounds heavier than the factory intercooler, and that's to be expected. No great revelation or surprises there. This is a much larger unit. The volumetric efficiency is much greater, hence the reason we're doing this modification. But be aware, if you're, if and when you do this, you are adding 20 pounds to the nose of the vehicle. And these little caps on the end, they weigh next to nothing, so they're not going to affect this comparison. But that's it. We'll move on to the next step. Okay, boys and girls, the shroud is on the workbench. I have the wiring harness removed from the shroud. This was very easy. All the fasteners cooperated, so no issues there. Let's talk about the shroud real quick before I begin modifications. Make sure that your white marks are to the bottom side of this plastic brace, beam, etc., whatever you call it. Just be conservative. You want to make sure that mark is aligned with the bottom edge. You do not want to take any material to the left of the white mark here. And I'm going to be very conservative. I'm going to cut to the right of the white mark and then sand away or carve away this, which I believe is nylon 6, this material. It's real easy to work with, but this is a point of no return. There's no recovery if you make a mistake here, which is unfortunate. It's one of those measure 3 times and cut once type of operation. As far as the brackets, also, it would be easy to mark this on the inside versus the outside. So make sure it is the bottom side of the shroud where you place the mark and you're doing the cutting. If you make it on the other side, again, that would make for a bad day. Okay, on this side, same situation, just in reverse. We don't want to take any material to the right of the white line. Everything that's going to be cut and removed will be to the left. And I, again, will be very conservative there. And then the cut for the, or the mark for the cutting on that bracket is to the outside or to the bottom of the shroud. Now, it is very easy to get confused when I initially read the instructions and I watched the video. It was hard to make sense of what they were cutting and what they were doing. Now that I have part in hand, it's on the workbench, it's very easy to see that they're taking material out of the bottom of the shroud to allow more room and more space for the intercooler. Very simple, very straightforward. It makes complete sense now. It did not before. The only other thing I would say is I was wondering if I did make a mistake, what is the part number to this? If I had to, if I got into that point of no recovery. Unfortunately, the tags on this are, they're weathered. Although this is a really new vehicle, it would have been nice if Kia Hyundai had actually imprinted the part number on this shroud. Yes, I know I can go to an online diagram and find it somewhere, but if I got into a bit of trouble when I needed this, it would just make it easier if they would actually imprint it in the material rather than using one of these labels, which now is unreadable. That's it. I'm going to move on to the next step. Modifications to the shroud are complete. The cutting, shaping, and sizing turned out really nice. This all cleaned up well, and I'm happy. Ditto for the other side. Taking a look at this, everything is nice and smooth. Take your time, be conservative, and it'll all turn out well. I used this large cutoff wheel Dremel attachment, and if you have a shroud, I suggest using it, because if you don't, you're going to have nylon bits, fragments, dust going in every direction, as I did. Also, use the highest or one of the higher RPM settings on your rotary tool, because when you're cutting nylon, you are cutting / melting the material, and the higher RPM, it makes for a cleaner cut. It expels all the bits and pieces as you're cutting, and they don't get bunched up along the edge. You'll get globs, and they just get in your way. So use a higher RPM setting and everything will work out well. Now let's flip this shroud. This is the orientation of how it goes in the vehicle, and now you can see the space that has been cut out, the additional space for the new intercooler. Mission accomplished. I'm happy with this. We'll go ahead and put the wiring harness back in the shroud, and we're good to go to the next step. Okay, back in the garage. The doors are down, the AC is on. It was nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit today, and I'm trying to keep things cool and comfortable. So let's do an update on the Kia Stinger project. You'll notice there are a number of things that are newly installed, and I'll go through those momentarily. First up is this JA Airscoop, which it's just stuck in place. I need to get an idea of how this is going to fit, and more specifically, there will be a part 2 to the shroud project. To make these Airscoops, there's one on each side, fit, you have to do further fabrication and removal of material from the shroud, and that is explained in the PDF provided by the manufacturer. I will say, however, it looks like they did a pretty rough job. Their take on it is you can also just remove the shroud, which I'm sure that's entirely possible, but if it were me, I would want as much of the shroud to go back in the vehicle as possible, and I think that's the case with the owner as well. So I will go back to the bench, the workbench in the basement, and we'll go through the modifications that need to be done for this. I'm going to do some measuring and things before I do that. Let's move to the engine compartment, and we're looking straight down at the blow-off valve manifold. Everything is bolted in place and it's nice and tight. So all the fasteners, the hose clamps, the worm gears, all of that. Do be aware that the hose on this right side is shorter than the one on the left side. Just you know, in case you're not aware, to get those properly fitted before you put this in place. Otherwise you'll have a problem. This is a beautiful component in terms of its machining, and whether you're you know, a casual observer, a DIYer, or a fluid dynamicist, this really deserves to be mounted on a wall somewhere. It's just it's really a nice piece. And I can say the same thing with regards to the JA Airscoop. This is 3D printed, although it gives the appearance of it being molded. It's so smooth. It's just a really nice piece, great quality. So let's take a look at the tubing below here. This is just the clamps and stuff are loose here at the bottom, but as you work your way up, those the clamps up there up top are directly beneath the manifold. Those are all tightened in place as they should be. One of the things I was concerned with on this side is the clearance, which I'm having trouble getting to, right there, kind of where my finger is. If you don't adjust that properly, meaning the tube and the fittings, the silicone to the aluminum tubing, it will touch. So be sure to work with that to provide adequate clearance. On this side, we have, scooting on the floor here, on this side things are much tighter. It's a shorter run from above, and everything looks really good. So there we go, we can see clearly. Again, these clamps are just loosely in place for the moment down below. Everything above is tight. So let's go up top, and this is the Mishimoto upgraded intake tubing, and this is the TMAP sensor, the temperature, manifold absolute pressure sensor, and of course we work our way around here to the silicone connector, which is much larger than factory. The clamps appear to be maybe off center or off kilter, but they're not. It's actually just the hose distorted a little bit, so the lines that you see make those clamps appear to be a little bit off center, but they're actually exactly as they should be. They're flush and they're tight. So just an appearance thing. Have a look at how close this engine intake is to the Mishimoto intake tube. I did have to finagle this some and make sure that there was, you know, some space there. It's not much, smaller than my pinky, probably about 1/8 of an inch. So otherwise, and I wanted to also mention, notice right there, the bottom of that silicone connector actually touches the valve cover. So it's not a big deal, but they are touching. And this is all, you know, one piece, the motor and everything, and the throttle body, it all moves together, so it's not like that's gonna cause a problem over time. Otherwise, next steps is to get this shroud shaped and sized further for these intakes. I'll go ahead and get the blow-off valves in place and start to put, you know, other things back into the vehicle, such as the new intercooler, which will be, you know, a great step. Very exciting project, a lot of fun. I think that's all I had to share in this segment. We will move on. Before we get to part 2 of work on the shroud, let's talk about the intakes. This is the stock item, this is the JA Airscoops, the upgraded item, and you'll have to remove the gasket from the stock intake, which not a problem, just pull it off. Do take note that there are notches and they're uneven on each side, so this gasket has to go in a specific orientation. The one on the left has an L, as you can see here, and the one on the right has an R for right. When you place this gasket on the JA Airscoops intake, the L or the R are going to be pointing upwards. So as you see this JA Airscoop logo on the bottom, it's actually on the bottom. You won't see this when it's on the vehicle, okay? So make sure that the letter L or R is pointing upward, and then everything should align itself. The other thing to be aware of is this will fight you a little bit, and the reason being, have a good look at these side by side, if I can get my thumb out of the way, and you may notice it, you may not, but the material of the 3D printed item is quite a bit thicker. So I'm not sure if you noticed before, but as I lay this on here, look how it kind of comes up short. That's not centered perfectly, but it's not, it's just, this gasket's just a touch too small for this this thicker material. So you're going to have to work with it. You see it's kind of, the material's hanging over the corners there. That's pretty noticeable. So be aware that the orientation, the letter is pointing up, and you're going to have to stretch and work this, because otherwise it will fight you, as it did me on the first one that I did. This next one will be a lot easier now that I know what to expect. Okay, time for show and tell. The shroud is temporarily affixed to the vehicle. It's held in place now by those studs. I don't have it bolted in, it's just loose fit. And then the intakes, the factory intakes, these come out with the shroud in place, and that's pretty easy. This one over here, same situation. I'm going to pull this out, I'm going to sit this aside gently, and then I'm going to grab the JA Airscoop, and right away you can see the dilemma. It does not fit in this space, and to make it fit, we have to be a lot of removal of the shroud here, at least on each end of the shroud. So you're going to have to spend some time cutting, shaping, and sizing that. And again, this is in the PDF instructions provided by the manufacturer. However, they did kind of a rough job, in my opinion. Beautiful component, but I would have liked a little bit more guidance on this. They don't show you how to mark, how to cut, where to cut. They just show you a picture of a piece of it that's cut away, and yeah, that could have been better. So I'm going to be super conservative, probably make an initial cut, leaving more in the shroud than needs to be, and then carve away additional pieces to make this fit. So that's my plan. Take the conservative approach, leave as much of the shroud intact, and we'll get on with it. Okay folks, this is part 2 of the shroud project, and this is only relevant if you are doing the JA Airscoops installation as part of this overall set of upgrades. We have one of the Airscoops here, which I had shown earlier in the video, and once the Airscoops are installed and the shroud is back in the vehicle, visually it will all make sense, but for now I want to go over what I had to do to the shroud to make the scoops fit. All of this, integrates together. Also, I did this segment of the video separately, so if you're not doing the JA Airscoops, you can just forward on to the next segment. As far as what we've done so far, the Mishimoto intercooler modifications were made earlier, and I showed those. We've done the cutaways here on the bottom, the shaping and sizing. It all looks good. And now let's get into what was done for the Airscoops. As you can see, there's some pretty serious cutting here. There's material that was removed that kind of wrapped around this, and I had to cut away a lot of material to accommodate the Airscoops. And on this side, you'll see much the same. And you know, it started here and then it went around all the way to the back. So if you're looking at the cuts side to side, let's take another look at this one. You're probably saying, hey, they're not the same. They're not the same because this is not a symmetrical setup. It's actually different side to side. So the fitment of this scoop in this space is different than on the other side. What I didn't like is the actual PDF instructions from JA Airscoops. It showed that they had cut away a great deal of this material, and much more than I cared to remove. So what I did was I took a very conservative approach. I cut this back a little bit at a time, and I would place the parts back in the vehicle to see if they were going to fit. I only took away what was really necessary, and that allowed me to leave as much of this material as possible. And for that reason, I'm very happy, because the goal is to integrate the scoops with the shroud and put the shroud back in the vehicle. And I believe it's important to put the shroud back in the vehicle, and we'll go over that in the next segment. But so far so good. Everything looks good with this shroud. I'm really happy, and let's move on to the next segment. My apology, I intended to show the backside of the shroud as well, so let's flip this over and have a look. Once this is in the vehicle, you will not be able to see some of the radius and carvings and things here. So get a good look at this from different angles, and we'll go over to this side as well. We'll do the same. You can see some pretty serious shaping here. This whole radius, this is the duct. The new ducts fit right in that slot or in that space. So it's a snug fit, but it's not overly tight or overly loose, just like I wanted it. Okay folks, time for an update from the garage. Let's take a look at what's going on underneath the hood. Since last time, I have installed the blow-off valves on the new Mishimoto manifold, and all the hoses, clamps, connections are as they should be. And also I've got these smaller hoses in place. I really like these. I've got this nylon wrapping. All the tiny clips are where they should be, including this this vacuum line that goes into the new Mishimoto intake tube, this electronic module, the connector, the snap, and again another clip up here at the intake itself. So everything is in its proper position, and I'm real pleased with how everything went together. You know, there are 8 bolts that hold these blow-off valves in place, so you're reusing the bolts from the factory to go on the new manifold. All of that looks really good. So there are 2 next order of business items. One is I'm going to put the shroud and the JA Airscoops in place. I'm going to show those and talk about those. I already have the brackets in place here for installation of the new intercooler. I also installed the standoff. I don't know if that is visible on the screen here, but anyway, you need to install those standoffs. There's one on each side. There's new bolts, or I should say nuts, for each of these. And the reason you need to do that is because the original brackets from the factory, they are not flat or not flat backed. They have a deviation there. So you need to use those standoffs to ensure that the new brackets, which are flat across the back or across the mounting point, to make sure that those go in place properly and they're not, you know, they're flush and everything. So that's just one thing to mention. Otherwise, real happy with the progress so far, and let's go on and take the next step. Okay folks, the Mishimoto intercooler is on deck. That is the next step. But first, let's go over the shroud and the Airscoops, specifically the JA Airscoops. And first, let's talk about the fasteners for the shroud. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 fasteners for the shroud. You have 2 fasteners for each of the scoops. You have one here, You have one below, one above, and again, one below if my finger would reach. These are all 10mm bolts, and they're all in their factory positions, so no surprises there. Now, the intent of what I did was to retain as much material, as much of the shroud material as possible when installing these scoops. And I think it's time for a sermon. The manufacturer of the scoops, they really give you the option of either cutting the shroud, which is the option that I took, and they also state that you can just remove the shroud. And I think the latter is a big mistake, and I'll explain why in just a moment. First of all, you know, the cutting and everything it took a lot of time and a lot of patience to get through this and to get it to look the way it does. So I'll just say that up front. The instructions from JA were just, you know, more or less they showed a very hard cut here and kind of a jagged cut, and I wasn't happy with that. So I put in the effort to make this look correct. Now, why is the shroud a big deal? Well, first of all, if you look at this, you've got the transmission cooler, the condenser, and the radiator. So you've got 3 layers of cooling going on in this space. And while the intent of these scoops is to really feed more air into the engine, or in this case, into these cone filters, which is going to work out, I think, beautifully, you really don't want to take away from the cooling efficiency of, you know, these 3 coolers, so to speak, as they're layered here. The shroud helps take air from the grill, and it keeps it feeding in this direction. It routes it. If you take this out and you toss it, you've got 4 inches of headroom here, tapering to 3 inches on each side, and you have 27 inches of cross, okay? That's a lot of lost turbulent air, or air that is going to get up into this cavity. It's going to push against that plastic plate that is directly behind the fascia. Your goal is not to cool the hood latch. Your goal is to keep air flowing through these radiators, through these coolers, and into the engine compartment. So, you know, if the manufacturer thought this wasn't important, they would not have included it on the vehicle. And in today's world, where they're trying to cut every corner and save every penny, they would have just not included this if they didn't feel that it was important. Furthermore, we're making a performance upgrade to a vehicle. I'm not a professional mechanic, but this isn't my first rodeo with regard to tuning. I've done a lot of projects like this, and you know, if the owner is taking this vehicle out to, I don't know, the drag strip, they're running it down the quarter mile time after time, or maybe to a time attack, maybe a half-mile runway type event somewhere, or maybe to a road course. Wherever it goes, it really needs to stay cool. And that's regardless of outside or the ambient temperature or how hard the car is being pushed. I'm not super familiar with this platform to know if they under-engineered or over-engineered the cooling system. You know, on this M5 over here as an example, there are things about this vehicle that are over-engineered and some that are kind of in the middle. You can take it to the track and hammer it all day long. It won't be particularly happy on a super hot day after several laps, but you know, it's doable and you can drive it to and from the track. I'm not sure about this platform. I don't know if you can do that, but nevertheless, we're looking to retain as much cooling efficiency here, not just concerned about only feeding air to the engine, to the intake, but you know, keep things cool, keep the transmission cool, keep the AC condenser happy, and keep the radiator happy. So that's the end of my sermon. This is the reason I did things this way, and I felt that this was important. Moving on to the next step, it will be the intercooler. This is pretty, you know, exciting because this is the overall, well, one of the major intents of the upgrades that are being done. So I'm going to wrap this up and we'll move on to the next segment. Okay, moving on to the next step. The intercooler is installed. The fasteners are in place. Everything's tightened and buttoned up, and let's get to that straight away. The hose clamps here, they're in their proper position, and what I'd like to do with these is I'd like to point the worm gear connectors actually down. So you can see this one is in that position, and so is that one. The reason being, if for some reason this vehicle was serviced in the future and these had to be loosened or removed, they're accessible by removing the under tray and not necessarily having to remove the entire front end of the vehicle, the fascia, etc. So who knows what might need to be done in the future, perhaps a radiator service or replacement, or who knows, but this will be accessible for future service. Now let's talk about the brackets. The bracket on the bottom is the factory Kia Hyundai bracket. The bracket up top is actually the proprietary bracket from Mishimoto. The 13mm nut on the left, it's actually affixed to the offset stud. That was the offset I showed earlier. The one on the right, that's actually a 10mm locking nut. So everything looks good there. I took a different approach to putting the intercooler in the vehicle versus the instructions. I did not bend the temperature sensor tab, which has this protective duct tape on it, and I did not remove the beam, okay, the actual bumper beam here. I didn't do any of that. I actually loosened the factory brackets, which when you do that, they lay downward a little bit, and that allows you to get the intercooler positioned on the brackets on both sides, and then you rock the intercooler forward. In doing so, it will clear this tab. It won't touch this tab at all. And then you put your top brackets in, and you go ahead and get everything nice and tightened as it should be. The question you're probably asking is, well, how in the world do you access the nuts? Well, you can see here that the 10mm, there's two 10mm nuts, or I'm sorry, bolts that affix that bracket to the vehicle, and those are accessible using an extension and a swivel. No problem whatsoever. Now, let's talk about these for just a second. Just like my sermon on the shroud, with regards to airflow, make sure that you install these. This helps put more air through the intercooler, and it doesn't get in behind the fascia and all of that. We're not trying to cool the fascia. We're trying to put as much air through this intercooler as possible. So make sure you take time to put these on. And also these Allen head, these are 4mm, I believe, Allen heads, and they're so tight against the intercooler that if you use a ratchet, you'll end up scratching or marring this surface. So you'll when you tighten these down, you'll need to use just a normal Allen wrench, unless you have something, some fancy extension that I haven't seen. But yeah, that's the way you'll need to take care of that. Now, I think this is a beautiful piece, beautiful component. I've said that before. Let's have a look underneath. Lots of space. It looks like you know, a factory installation, which is really nice. Let's roll over to this side. As you can see, hose clamps, connectors pointing downward. Same situation in that space. I'm not sure how well I'm getting a shot of that, but anyway, the connectors are nice and tight. Hose clamps are nice and tight. But what you probably have noticed is the bracket on this side is missing. And I'm going to actually pause the video and go to the workbench, and we're going to talk about an issue, actually a manufacturing defect, that I'm having to create a workaround for. Not a big deal, but let's move on to that. Okay, we're on the workbench, and as I mentioned, there is a minor manufacturing defect that I'm dealing with. We'll get to that straight away. The bracket on the right is the upper left bracket for the intercooler. This is the factory item or component, and this is the mounting bolt that goes in this position, as well as the 10mm nut that affixes to the stud that passes through the bracket. So let's set those items aside. This is the proprietary bracket from Mishimoto, and the fasteners which were included with this system. So on the right you have the 13mm nut, the offset, and the 10mm locking nut on the left. Nothing remarkable about these two items. Okay, we're going to put those aside. However, this is where we're having a problem. And if you look at this offset from top to bottom, you'll notice that the bottom is, the threads and the stud are nice, true, and straight. The ones above are actually bigger. And this is supposed to be the same size top to bottom. This is an M8 sized offset, and the threads are 1.25 pitch. However, when I measured this this offset top to bottom with this digital caliper, it actually showed that the ones on the top were actually bigger. I think again it was 7.9 for the threads on the bottom, and it was like 8.2 for the threads on the top. Not sure if that's focusing or not, but hopefully you can see that. Now they're a little, the threads on the top there are a little skinned up, and I'll tell you what happened. The way I do things is I only use power tools for the removal of fasteners on vehicles, and then when I put things back together, I would take a nut like this and I would put it on finger tight as far as I can, and then I would move to hand tools. No power tools involved. However, when I put this nut on the larger threads and I started to turn it, as I got further down the threads, it became harder and harder to turn, and that's why you can see the threads are still true. They're not mangled, but they actually, the nut actually just shaved some of the stainless steel off of this stud. So not the end of the world. The question is, how do we recover from this? I'm not going to call it Mishimoto and have a delay of getting a replacement. It's not something you can just run to the Kia dealer to get. It's a Mishimoto part. So what I'm going to do instead is use these items here. So this is an A270 stainless steel M8 1.25 pitch bolt, and the washer itself is also a stainless steel item, and it's the same thickness as the offset. I can't quite, hopefully that's got the camera on it. So it's exactly what I need. So what I will now do is I'll put these aside, and this this bolt will pass through here, and this will serve, doing this with one hand is a little tricky. You can see I will have the offset that I need. So this is purely a substitute. This is just a way to get around this. I am using the same stainless steel grade components, so the fasteners are all good. I have another one here just for comparison. This is a zinc coated washer. I won't be using that because these typically rust. It's just a matter of time. So we're going to go all stainless steel. That will be the substitute for this this set of items here, and all is good. So that's the way I'm going to work. That's my workaround, and we'll move on to the next step. Let's take a quick look at the offset bolt fastener solution. The right upper intercooler bracket is back in place. The nut on the left there, that's the 10mm locking nut. It's in position, and on the right, we have the new substitute 13mm stainless steel bolt, which I am aware that bolt is too long for this application, but I did check it on the back side of the structure, and it's not touching or impeding anything. I may even cut that off with a Dremel tool. As far as a washer with that bolt on this side of the bracket, it wasn't necessary because that the hole for that bolt is right sized. It is a proper M8 sized hole, so no need for a washer. Now on the back side, where the effectively the spacer is, or the substitute washer is in place of that offset fastener, you can just see it a little bit in camera. It's, again, that's a stainless steel washer. It's double the thickness of a standard washer, so it's really ideal for you know, what we need here. So I'm really happy with the way this turned out. A minor issue, but something that could be a major setback if you're unable to come up with an alternative and do so in a short amount of time. It's really unfortunate that something as small as this can be either a minor or a major setback, but it's also hard to understand with all of the wonderful craftsmanship and the engineering that went into this intercooler that something this small can create an issue for you. But again, this is a unique item, so not a big deal. We got through it, and let's move on. As part of this project, I'm also doing an oil and filter change. There's nothing too remarkable here except for this drain plug, which Kia Hyundai included as part of the oil filter housing. That allows you to drain the oil out of the housing before removing the filter on this end and showering yourself with oil. So bravo to Kia and Hyundai for doing that. I also should mention that it would be nice for them to get this wire loom back out of the way a little bit. And it would be nice if they include a replacement rubber O-ring for the drain plug. This is a 6mm Allen head drain plug. Take note that there's very little space between the oil filter housing and the stabilizer bar. So you're not going to be able to use a socket or anything like that. You're going to have to use a short Allen wrench, or you may have to take an Allen wrench and actually cut it down to fit into that space. But that was again, very nice touch, and I like that a lot. Now, if you're going to do an oil change on this vehicle, be sure that you have a 27mm socket. Don't use pliers. Don't use an adjustable wrench. Get a proper socket, or get yourself a set of sockets, large sockets. And my last comment is, I would love to see a bigger oil filter. This is rather small. I've seen smaller ones on Hondas and things like that, but this is, for this vehicle and the type of vehicle, the type of driving that it will endure, it needs a bigger filter. I am aware that there's an aftermarket company making a billet oil filter housing, but that doesn't take care of the problem. Give me a bigger nylon housing and a bigger oil filter. That would be great. Okay, boys and girls, we are into the lightning round with this vehicle, closing in on the last of the project parts and pieces. Today is catch can day and spark plugs. So I've got the plugs and the coils on the floor here, and yeah, everything looks pretty normal. I'm going to check the gap on those to see if they're what they should be. We are going with HKS plugs. We're going to do a 0.24 gap on those plugs because again, this gentleman's going to do kind of I would call it like a stage 1.75 tune, if that makes sense. He's not going to do meth, but he is going to do an ECU tune. So that's what we're planning for, and hence the reason we're going for a 0.24 gap. Now, let me position this light here very quickly. One of the big pains I had was this breather tube, okay? And the reason being is, if you look at the nipple that it attaches to down there, not a big deal, shouldn't be, but from the factory, the hose clamp, the orientation was pointing downwards. So yeah, that was difficult. I had to go deep in the toolbox to get like some mini pliers and kind of blindly reach in behind that and pull that off. But that took more time than the actual total duration of the install should take, which is 30 minutes. So it fought me, and those things happen. Let's have a look down at the spark. Well, the spark plugs are not in, but at the through the heads and into the cylinders there. You can see that is one of the ports. That one's really hard to see there. Nevertheless, try to get a little light on it. This one's almost a straight approach. And then the driver's side, as everyone that's worked on these vehicles knows, this is the easy side. So I did disconnect a few things and move some of the brackets and stuff around, but it didn't create that much of a challenge. I like the snaps. I like a lot of the connections. It's good quality. There's some BMW-esque things on this motor, and for that matter on this vehicle. And when I say that, I don't mean that as a benchmark. because trust me, there's things that BMW could do so much better. In fact, the best vehicles that I've ever worked on, from just a mechanical perspective, are Mercedes-Benz. They're actually designed to be worked on. They're built to be taken apart and put back together, and there's a logic to it. I've nearly killed myself on some of the BMW projects I've worked on, and I'm seeing that, you know, there's some very smart things that are being done in the Kia Hyundai camp, and I like that. So kudos to them. That's the two main things we're doing today, and then I'm going to take the vehicle out, road test it, make sure that there's no check engine lights. I'll wash the vehicle and return it to the customer. So that's it. Have a good one. Okay, boys and girls, let's wrap up this project. Today is customer pickup day. Customer will take delivery this afternoon. In the meantime, let's go over a couple of things. The Mishimoto catch can is installed. I really like this catch can, as with everything from Mishimoto. Great quality. The bracket fits really well, and it's all quality. What I don't care for is this inlet tube, which is touching the kind of the strut tower here where it joins the firewall, and there's really nothing you can do about that. Well, I guess you could shorten up the hose a little bit maybe, but then it might turn it too aggressive an angle. But as you can see, the catch can has been rotated as much as it can be, and it's still touching. So I've instructed the owner to just check the hose once in a while when emptying the can, that you know, make sure there's no rub marks or anything on it. So and you know, worst case, the hose would have to be replaced at some point in the future. But that is how this system, this catch can, is designed. So as far as the spark plugs, they are installed. Spark plugs are always a challenge for, you know, regardless of what vehicle you're doing them on. And I know per the manufacturer's instructions, you're supposed to remove the manifold. You don't have to do that. The coil packs are actually, the connectors are flexible enough that you can get all of this apart without having to do that. Nevertheless, you still have to disconnect, loosen, and move things out of your way to make this project possible. And we went with HKS plugs. That includes a 0.024 gap, which will allow us to get into some serious tuning here. The owner is looking at 4 to 5 different tuning options, ECU tuning, not just piggybacks, or maybe a combination thereof. And from there, we will take the next step with this vehicle. I did start the vehicle. I allowed it to achieve operating temperature. I took it for a test drive. I even did a single draggy run just to establish, I guess you would call it a baseline, although this vehicle wasn't baseline when it was purely stock. So it was kind of a in between, if you will, to see where things are. But nevertheless, this was a very, at times, fun and challenging project. At other times it was aggravating, just as with any project. So long, hard hours on this, but it was enjoyable, and we're moving on to the next step. So stay tuned. We'll get into the ECU tuning next, and I'm looking forward to it. So take care.